Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to call the meeting to order. We're moving on to the approval of the agenda. The agenda for the special meeting held May 20, 2025 be approved as presented. May I have a mover, please? Thank you. Seconder, please.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any comments or questions from members? Here seeing none, I'll call the vote. All in favor, and that is carried. Thank you. And move on to 3, disclosure of pecuniary interest, the general nature thereof. Does any member have a pecuniary interest for any of the items on the agenda? And if so, what is the general nature of that interest? Here and see none, so we'll move on to 4, motions for draft consideration. That the council of the corporation of Village of Merrickville-Wolford receive for information the motions for consideration documented as presented. May I have a mover, please? Moved. Thank you. Seconder, please. Moved and seconded. Any comments or questions from members? We hear and see none, so we'll call the vote. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Number 5, we're going to move on to presentations. 5.1, Watch and Associate Economic Limited, or Economics Limited, sorry. That the council of the corporation of the Village of Merrickville-Wolford receive for information the presentation for the water and wastewater rate study and development charge preliminary assessment from Watson and Associates Economics Limited. May I have a mover, please? Thank you. Moved. Second?
I'll second.
And seconded. Thank you. I'll now ask Peter Cisco to provide the presentation from Watson Associates. Peter, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming out. We appreciate you presenting in person.
Thank you very much for having me back in Merrickville-Wolford. Once again, I know it's been a little while. I think last time was around this time last year, presenting the non-core asset management plan. Since that time, we have continued to work with the municipality on a few engagements, all of them revolving around asset management, managing infrastructure, and specifically the financial aspects of managing infrastructure. And so the intent of the presentations today is to provide a summary of or overview of the water wastewater asset management plan and rate study that we have been completing, as well as the development charges assessment. We wanted to share that information with council in this format before releasing the formal reports, which will be prepared in short order. So if we could go right to the next slide, the first of these studies that I'll be speaking to is the water wastewater rate study. And so this is being undertaken as a asset management plan for the municipality's water and wastewater infrastructure as required by Ontario Regulation 58817. The municipality did previously complete a asset management plan, or an initial asset management plan, I would say, for water wastewater assets in 2021. Since that time, there are some additional regulatory requirements that have come into play. Specifically by July 1st of this year, municipalities are required to have a financial strategy to support the asset management plan as well. And so it was felt that this was a good opportunity to combine that asset management for water wastewater infrastructure with a rate study assessment as well, to ensure that the rates that the municipality is charging to water wastewater customers fully embrace those capital costs of infrastructure along with the operating costs as well. And so the water wastewater rate study is being completed with regard for a few notable elements. Specifically, we've looked at the customer profile in terms of the customers that are currently connected to the water wastewater systems, looked at current and recent historical consumption patterns. We've looked at the extent of future developments that's expected within the municipality as well, to get a sense of how many additional customers are expected to connect to those systems in the future years. We've also done a detailed analysis of the infrastructure that supports the provision of water wastewater services, including the underground infrastructure, as well as the facilities in terms of treatment and pumping and so on, and looked at the life cycle needs of that infrastructure, both in terms of the next 10 years, and I'll speak to all of that in a little bit more detail shortly, but also looking at the longer term funding needs of that infrastructure portfolio as well, recognizing that a lot of the infrastructure, particularly supporting water and wastewater services, is very long lived. And so typically we're not just looking at a 10-year window, we do need to consider the full life cycle costs of that infrastructure as well. So if we could go to the next slide. Before we get into the specifics, just wanted to provide this diagram which illustrates the overall methodology that we follow when undertaking a water wastewater rate study. And I would say there are 4, I know there are a lot of component parts on the screen there. But there are four major aspects to the rate study undertaking. Firstly, we need to look at the costs of operating or providing water wastewater services. And there are two components to that. Firstly, we have capital, right? We understand that there's a great amount of infrastructure that's both in the ground and on the ground providing services. And so we're looking at that infrastructure and trying to assess both what specific life cycle replacements and renewal activities would need to be completed over the next 10 years for that infrastructure to remain in a state of good repair and to be able to continue providing services. So again, a specific 10-year forecast of life cycle renewal and replacements. But then we're also taking that long-term view. So recognizing, again, as I said earlier, that a lot of the infrastructure is very long-lived, trying to understand what are the average annual life cycle costs of that infrastructure portfolio, recognizing that each and every year that the infrastructure is in service, it's effectively being consumed. And so in a full cost assessment of any service, including water, wastewater, we need to recognize those average annual life cycle costs of all the assets that are supporting service provision. So that's the first major element. The second major element then is looking at developing a funding strategy. So that's working across the top towards the right, looking at what are the different sources of funding relative to those capital needs. And we're typically looking at things like, are there external grants that might be available to offset some of these capital needs? Are there reserves and reserve funds that have accumulated that can be used to offset some of those needs? And how much is built into the rate revenues that's available to support capital needs of the infrastructure as well. So we're trying to come up with a funding strategy for both that 10-year forecast as well as the longer term needs of the system. So that's the second element. The third major element, this is kind of moving down the right-hand side of the illustration, is looking at the operating budget aspect of service provision as well. And so that's where we're looking at the different operating costs, such as the aqua contract, items like insurance, contract costs, utilities, things like that. But we're also trying to ensure that within that operating analysis, we're looking at any existing debt servicing costs, looking at any future debt servicing costs that might arise as a result of the funding strategy to support the capital plan. And then also ensuring that within that operating budget forecast, there is a sufficient amount of annual transfers to reserves and reserve funds that's built in and supported by the rates to support the longer term needs of the system as well, to ensure that it's operated financially in a sustainable position. So those three elements together give us the bulk of the financial or the cost analysis. And then going back to the left-hand side of the illustration, we'll see the two dark blue ovals there, the growth forecast and the user count and profile. So in order to ultimately calculate user rates, we need to look at both the number of customers that are currently connected to the system. We need to look at the consumption patterns of those customers, recognizing that there is a consumptive component to water, wastewater bills as well. And then we're also looking at a future growth. So how is that customer profile expected to change typically over the next 10 years? How much additional chargeable consumption will that customer growth generate? So that we're then taking the costs of operating the systems, including operating and capital, and dividing all of that by the appropriate denominator. So those are the four kind of major elements of a rate study undertaking. So with that said, we can go to the next slide. We have a summary of the rates that are currently in effect. As council is likely aware, there are different components to the rate structure and different charges for different types of customers. The rate structure that's in place in the municipality and has been in place for quite some time is very common across municipalities in the province. And it has two major elements. Firstly, there's a fixed base rate that gets charged based on the number of residential or non-residential units that are associated with the customer account. And that's a fixed base rate, so it doesn't vary with the amount of consumption. And this is a very common element of rate structures in many municipalities. And that fixed base rate provides a certain level of revenue stability and predictability within the rate structure because it doesn't vary with consumption. The other or second element of the rate structure is the metered rate, which gets applied to the amount of consumption in excess of the amount of consumption that's provided within the base rate. So for residential customers, they get 7.5 cubic meters per month. That's included within the month fixed base rate. And for non-residential customers, they get 15 cubic meters per month. That's not chargeable, but any consumption in excess of that gets charged based on the unit rates that are shown in the table. For water, that's $2.97 per cubic meter. And for wastewater, that's $5.97 per cubic meter. I would note here that the rate structure itself is not something that's being evaluated at this time through this process. So we're maintaining the structure as it is, including the base rates and the metered rates, and maintaining different charges on the base rate side for residential and non-residential customers. However, it's the quantum of the charge, so the amount of the base rates and the metered rates that are being evaluated through this process. So on the next slide, then we have a summary of the customer and consumption profile. In this case, looking at water customers, we've looked at quite a bit of historical billing and consumption data to come up with the analysis. What's shown here is a summary of, I believe, the past 3 calendar years, with the bars illustrating for each 2-month billing cycle what the amount of metered water consumption was in total, as well as showing with the lighter blue or upper portion of the stacked bars what the percentage of total consumption was that was ultimately chargeable. So that's the consumption in excess of what's provided within the base rates. The line across the top is then showing the number of customer accounts that have been connected to the system. In this case, again, we're looking at water going back to early 2022. We have seen that number of customer accounts was relatively stable for some time. However, the municipality did see some growth in that customer base last year, with about 23 customer accounts being added over the course of 2025. This analysis has also allowed us to then look at what is the average consumption per customer. And in particular, we were looking at residential customers, as most of the growth that's expected to occur over the next 10 years within the municipality is expected to be residential development. And we are seeing that on average, residential customers are on a per unit basis consuming about 110 to 127 cubic meters of water annually, with about 34% of that, or about 37 cubic meters over the course of the year, being chargeable. And so that's very much in line with what we've seen in terms of average consumption levels across the province, based on many rate studies that we have completed. If anything, it's at the lower end of what we're seeing in terms of average consumption. And I think that's probably a product of customers responding to price signals, with, as we'll see later, in comparative terms or relative terms, the prices of water, wastewater services are quite high within the municipality relative to virtually every other municipality in the province. So I think it's, again, customers responding to those price signals and reducing consumption levels in response. And it's also this natural product of, as people renovate, as they replace appliances, we're getting more energy efficient appliances that use less water. So there's this natural decline in consumption levels that we've seen across the province as a result of that as well. So on the next slide, then we have a very similar summary, in this case, showing the number of wastewater customer accounts, as well as the amount of chargeable water consumption that's associated with those wastewater accounts. I would note that there are about close to 60 or just under 60 fewer wastewater customers than there are water customers, indicating that there are some customers that are connected to the municipal water system but are on private septics, so aren't connected to the wastewater services. And that's important because in order to calculate an appropriate water rate and a wastewater rate, we need to understand those customer profiles independently. So when we go to the next slide, then we start to think about the future. And in this case, this slide is summarizing the growth forecast that has been prepared based on a number of sources. And again, we're trying to estimate a couple of things here for the next 10 years, both looking at how many additional billing units will become part of the billing system, so with number of additional residential customers connecting, as well as how much additional chargeable consumption will those new residential units generate, which we're then adding to the total chargeable consumption levels and spreading the costs over that chargeable consumption. So in total, for both water and wastewater, there are about 192 additional residential billing units that are expected to connect to these systems over the next 10 years, so that being from 2026 to 2035. That does represent a relatively large amount of growth in relative terms, about a 23% increase in billable consumption on the water side, for example, and about a 26% increase in billable consumption on the wastewater side. So that customer growth is generating quite a bit of additional demand relative to what exists currently. As noted on the slide here, that growth forecast was developed based on consultations with the municipality's planning consultants, JP2G. We did look at both how much development is expected to occur in terms of committed units, including infill vacant properties, as well as a number of approved registered subdivisions. And then also assuming that there will be the ability to go a little bit beyond that existing capacity with some of the wastewater infrastructure replacement that's envisioned within the 10-year forecast, addressing some of the existing inflow and infiltration issues that will free up some capacity that will enable growth to continue beyond the existing capacity as well. So again, about 192 additional residential units that are projected to be added to the systems over the next 10 years. So having looked at the customer base and consumption profile and how that's expected to change, the next slide here provides a summary of the infrastructure that's supporting services. So we're getting into the capital aspect of the assessment. In terms of the asset inventory, which comprises the linear underground infrastructure, the fire hydrants, the various pumping stations, treatment facilities, and so on. On the left-hand side, you see how what that replacement cost of that infrastructure is for water assets. Currently, that's sitting at about $27.3 million. And on the right-hand side, the donut chart illustrates the breakdown of wastewater assets. And in total, the replacement cost of the wastewater infrastructure is about $26.6 million. And just to pause there, I want to note that that is a significant amount of infrastructure on a per customer basis, right? So when we look at the number of water accounts relative to the replacement cost of water infrastructure, there's about $56,000 worth of water infrastructure per water customer account. When we look at wastewater, there's about $62,000 of wastewater infrastructure per customer account. And so for a wastewater customer, there's about almost $120,000 worth of infrastructure for each customer that's in the ground and on the ground. So that's a significant amount of investment that's been made historically to make sure that the services are there. And it's a significant amount of infrastructure burden effectively that falls on each customer to finance the maintenance and upkeep of over time. That is also just, I don't have specific numbers, but we often look at these metrics through other rate studies as well in terms of what that infrastructure is per customer. It is at the very high end of what we typically see. That's a product of it being a relatively small system, so there isn't the benefit of economies of scale. So on a per customer basis, the amount of infrastructure is quite large, and which then ultimately translates into the customer bills, as we will see later. So one of the key elements that we look at within the rate study before we get into the specifics of the forecast is what is the long run average annual life cycle cost of the infrastructure? And that's illustrated within the circle towards the bottom of the slide there, where on an average annual basis, the life cycle costs of the water wastewater infrastructure combined are about $848,000. And so that number is important because it represents what a sustainable level of capital funding would be year after year that should be built into the rates. And it's not kind of addressing peaks and troughs around asset replacement, but as a long run average, that's the level of funding that should be built into the rates. And I'll come back to that number a little bit later. So then on the next slide, moving away from kind of the current infrastructure and the long run needs, as part of the rate study and the asset management plan, we need to develop a specific forecast, typically looking ahead a 10-year period. So we're covering the period 2026 to 2035, looking at what specific infrastructure replacements and renewal needs might exist within these systems over that period. The forecast was developed using a number of sources. Firstly, in terms of the water main infrastructure, the replacement forecast was developed by a detailed analysis of the asset inventory, looking at the in-service years for individual pipes. I know Aqua maintains a spreadsheet with that information, as well as some information on the history of breaks for individual pipe segments, and so on. When we look at that inventory of water mains, and it's illustrated with the little chart towards the right-hand side of the slide there, and we look at the in-service years, there's a significant amount of that infrastructure that's nearing or basically at the end of its useful life. So a significant amount of the water main network was installed in the 1947 to 1950 period, with another chunk installed in the early 1960s as well. And that amount of infrastructure really should be considered for replacement over the next 10 to 20 years. I think ideally, when we first started looking at it, we were thinking about a potentially a 10-year replacement plan. That doesn't appear to be financially feasible. So we are looking at a 20-year replacement plan for that portion of the infrastructure. That portion of the water mains represents about 67%. So just over 2/3 of the total water main length that's in need of replacement over the next 10 to 20 years. And the current replacement cost of that infrastructure would be about $14 million. And so again, we're trying to spread that out evenly over the next 20 years, which you will see a little bit. In terms of the costing for those replacement projects, we have worked closely with staff to look at some budgeted replacements, specifically the Wellington Street reconstruction project, which is currently in the early planning phases, to look at where that pricing is coming in, to establish the appropriate replacement costs for this future forecast as well. When we look at the wastewater mains then, in terms of replacement, what's interesting is that infrastructure was mostly put in place in the 1970s. So it is younger than the water infrastructure. So strictly based on age, theoretically, it's not in need of replacement immediately. However, as we are aware, there have been known issues with inflow and infiltration, which are eating up capacity at the treatment plant that will need to be addressed. So there are some signs of wear and tear on that infrastructure that will need to be addressed. And secondly, it typically makes sense to plan the replacement of that infrastructure when roads are being dug up to replace water mains as well. And so we've taken the approach of aligning the wastewater main replacement forecast with segments of roads where water mains are planned to be replaced over the next 20 years. And so over the next, again, 10 to 20 years, the municipality is facing the replacement of about 5 kilometers of wastewater mains, or just over that, which represents about 71% of the overall wastewater main network. And the total current replacement costs of the wastewater mains that have been identified for replacement over the next 10 to 20 years is about $8.8 million. And then finally, thinking about the facility assets, again, treatment and pumping and so on. The Ontario Clean Water Agency maintains a major maintenance and capital recommendations forecast for the municipality, which goes out to 2034 or 35. So we've embedded that into the rate study as well, which identifies specific equipment replacements and renewals or pump rebuilds, for example, that may be required over that period as well. So that's to hopefully summarize some of the inputs that went into the assessment in terms of what that's telling us for the next 10 years at least. We have that illustrated on the slide here. So this provides a 10-year forecast of the capital expenditures for water and wastewater combined. Over the next 10 years, again, looking at water, wastewater combined, we are looking at total capital expenditures of about $13.2 million in today's dollars, with about 7.8 million of that being related to water infrastructure and the remaining 5.3 million being related to wastewater. So as an annualized average, that's illustrated with the upper of the two horizontal lines, and it's relatively stable around that average. The municipality is facing about $1.3 million of capital expenditures each year for the next decade. And I would note, I know it's not shown here on the slide, but as we talked about, a lot of the infrastructure needs are really looking at averaging the needs out over a 10 to 20 year period. So the next decade after that is expected to look very similar as well. So a significant amount of renewal just because of where a lot of the infrastructure happens to be in its life cycle and some of the issues that you're starting to see, particularly around the inflow and infiltration issues on the wastewater side. Before we move on from here, I did want to note, and that's illustrated, and it's a little bit hard to see here, at least for me, but there's a lower horizontal line as well, which illustrates that longer run average annual life cycle cost. And that's, as we talked about earlier, is about $848,000. And so that longer run average sitting below the needs over the next 10 years indicates that this is a particularly heavy period of asset renewal and replacement that you're facing. And in an ideal world, this would be a time to start drawing down reserves that have accumulated from years past to help shave off some of those peaks. There is some money in reserves, but it's not going to cover certainly this 10-year forecast. We'll get into that a little bit later, but just wanted to note that part of the challenge in coming up with a funding plan is that we don't necessarily want to increase rates to a level that they can fully fund those capital expenditures expected over the next 10 years, because we would be overfunding that long run average. And so this would then be a time to leverage some external borrowing, debt financing, to help make up some of the difference. And so we'll come back to that shortly when we look at the overall funding plan. The last element of this chart I'd like to point out is the little white dot that you see in 2026, it's partway up the stacked bar there. That represents the level of capital funding that's supported by your water wastewater rates currently. And so that's looking at how much of the rate revenues after we net off operating expenditures are available to be transferred to capital reserves or are paying for previously incurred debt. So they're covering the capital related aspects of operations. That's sitting at about $682,000, which is about 80% of the funding target, which is actually a very good position to be in. In many cases, when we're doing these rate studies, we're finding that infrastructure funding gap, which is the difference between that longer run life cycle cost and the current capital funding capacity, is a lot bigger. So that means your water wastewater rates are providing about 80% of the capital funding that's required to sustain the utilities over the long run. What it also is showing us, however, is that perhaps the rates haven't been there long enough to generate enough reserve accumulation to help shave off some of the funding needs that are expected over the next 10 to 20 years. I just wanted to note that again, from a long run perspective, the rates are in a relatively good point. It just happens to be a particularly heavy period of asset renewal that you're facing. So with that, I'll switch gears to the operating side here for a second before we bring it all together. So as mentioned earlier, one of the things we need to look at is the operating forecast as well. The operating forecast has two components. It has the operating expenditures. So we've looked at the municipality's 2025 operating budget. We've consulted with staff. We've also looked at some historical trends to look at how should we model that operating budget moving forward. And generally, most of the operating costs are being adjusted at 2.2% annually to account for inflation. There are two exceptions to that. Insurance costs are increasing at about 10% annually. That's just based on looking what insurance rates have done over the past 5 or so years and how those have escalated and have certainly been above inflationary adjustments. And then also looked at the aqua contract costs, which are being increased at about 5% annually over the forecast period. Again, in line with what those historical year-over-year increases have been over the past 5 or so years. And so in total, then the operating expenditures for water and wastewater combined are increasing from about $0.8 million in 2025, based on the budget, to about $1.2 million by 2035 with those inflationary adjustments. So that's the first part of the operating forecast. The second part are capital related expenditures, which are primarily debt servicing costs, as well as annual transfers to reserves and reserve funds, which are based on the capital funding plan, which we'll get into just a little bit from now. So on the next slide, we have I think this is a great chart because it brings together all the kind of expenditure elements of the forecast or provide an overall financial picture. So just to walk through the various components that are on the slide here. So firstly, the bars or the stacked bars, to be more exact, correspond to expenditures in each year over the forecast period, starting with the 2025 budget and then forecasting out from 2026 onwards. The lowest portion of the bars, or the light orange, represents the net operating expenditures that we need rates to cover. On top of that, with the teal portion of the bars that's growing over the period, that represents annual debt servicing costs in terms of principal and interest payments on any incurred debt, both from years past as well as any additional debt that will need to be taken on to support the capital plan over the next 10 years. And then the final component of the stacked bars is the green portion at the top, and that represents capital expenditures that are forecasted for each year. And I would note that the chart here is not presented in current dollars. It does include those inflationary adjustments in each year as well. So that's the expenditure side. The lines then corresponds to revenues, with the first of the lines, the black line, corresponding to the billing revenues that are needed to support operations. I'll speak to kind of what that translates into in terms of rates in just a little bit, but this is showing the overall revenue requirement for each year. And we see that there's a need to grow those annual water wastewater revenues from about $1.5 million in 2025 to about $2.5 million by 2035. Before I get to the second line, which corresponds to debt, let me just explain one final element here. So if you look at 2026, for example, which is, I guess, the second bar from the left, you will see that the total expenditures in that year are forecasted to exceed revenues. So the bar is sitting higher than the revenue line in that year. So that means that, again, total expenditures are exceeding the revenues in that year. And there are two options as to how to manage that. You know, on one hand, there could be a drawdown of reserves that takes place to make up the difference. And in fact, that's what you see happening in 2026. So the reserve fund balance is illustrated with that purple mountain, if you will, that's shown in the background. And you will see that between 2025 and 2026, that mountain is coming down. So that means the reserve is being drawn down to make up the difference between expenditures and revenues in 2026. When we get to a year like 2028, which would be the fourth bar from the left, you will see again, expenditures primarily driven by capital exceed total revenues in that year, but there is no more reserve at that point in time to draw down. So the difference has to come from external financing. And so that's shown with the teal line, which shows the debt proceeds that would need to be taken on that year. So additional debt financing to pay for the rest of the capital program in that year. So this illustration shows again the total of expenditures and how those expenditures will be funded over the period. And then the table on the top left provides a summary of the major funding sources for capital expenditures, at least. So in total, in inflated terms, we're expecting about $16.8 million of capital expenditures, with just over half of that being funded through rate revenues through reserves, and just under half of that being funded through external debt. So about $8.3 million of additional debt financing that would be required to support this plan over the next 10 years. And of course, each year that additional debt financing is taken on, that results in increased principal and interest payments in the following year. And that's why you see that teal portion of the stacked bars increasing over the period. So that's being accounted for as well. So with that, let's maybe look at the next slide just to dive a little bit deeper into the debt analysis, because there is quite a bit of additional debt that's projected to be required to support this plan over the next 10 years. So we've run a forecast out to 2035 or to 2036 in some cases to look at the total amount of outstanding principal that you would have with respect to water wastewater services by the end of the forecast period. And what this is showing us is that by the end of 2035, the municipality would have about $9.3 million of outstanding debt principal for water wastewater services alone. And the annual debt servicing costs related to that principal by 2036 would be about $748,000 per year. And so that would represent about 28% of water wastewater revenues by 2036. So a significant amount of revenue, of course, that's being applied to pay for the principal and interest payments associated with that debt. What we are then doing at the bottom part of the illustration there is showing the annual principal and interest payments and how those would evolve over the period, and showing those relative to the provincially mandated debt capacity limit or ceiling, which says that municipalities, in terms of that their debt servicing costs cannot exceed 25% of own source revenue. I would note that the calculation of that debt capacity is not compartmentalized between water and wastewater and tax supported services. It looks at overall revenues for a municipality, but just for illustrative purposes here, we've illustrated with the bottom part of the chart what the principal and interest payments for water wastewater would correspond to relative to the water wastewater billing revenues, or 25% of that. And so what that's showing, if you look at 2035, 2036, so the last two bars on the bottom chart, is that those bars start to exceed 25% of own source revenues within those years. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be in exceedance of the limit, because again, this is just looking at this relative to water wastewater revenues. The calculation is broader than that, but just as it's still a significant amount of debt, representing again about 28% of water wastewater revenues by 2036. And I think the additional challenge here is, as mentioned earlier, that this amount of capital investment is likely to continue for the decade afterwards as well, right? So with this amount of debt load, that's something to keep in mind, is that there might be some pressure to start deferring capital needs after that 10-year period, unless some external sources of funding can be secured in the form of grants. We did have a discussion about that as we were developing the forecast. It was felt that, at least at this point, to present the information without reliance on any external grants, because those are a big unknown. But of course, if the municipality is successful in securing some external grant funding, that would offset some of the debt needs that are being shown here for the forecast period. So it wouldn't have any impact on the rates that I'll share with you shortly. It would just reduce the debt load and would mean that more money can be transferred to reserves, and would help paint a better financial picture over the short term. So that's the debt analysis. So let's get into the rates. So again, now we kind of bring it all together, and I know there are a lot of numbers in this table here. I have a better illustration one slide from now. But this provides a breakdown of all the different components of the rate structure. So showing the monthly base rates for residential customers, the monthly base rates for non-residential units as well, and then the metered service rates for water at the top of the table and wastewater at the bottom of the table. The rate forecast was developed with the objective on the water side of closing the infrastructure funding gap by 2030. And I should have noted earlier, the infrastructure gap is really, or we see that present on the water side. So wastewater services are fully funded as it stands right now. But we are looking to address the funding gap within water, and we're looking to address that over the next 5 years. And then we're also balancing out the metered service rates and the monthly base rates, such that the metered service rates are recovering about 39% of operating costs, and with the monthly base rates recovering all of the capital related costs plus the remaining 61% of operating costs. So there's some rebalancing that's happening there. And so what that's showing is that on the water side, both the metered rates as well as the monthly base rates would need to increase at about 10% annually for the next 5 years, with that leveling off somewhat after 2030, with the base rates increasing at about 1.6% annually thereafter, and the metered service rates increasing at about 6.2% thereafter. So that's all on the water side. On the wastewater side, because there is no existing funding gap, so capital is fully funded, the rates fully fund both operating and capital needs of the system, even though there will continue to be inflationary pressures on the expenditure side. With the additional customer growth, what this is showing is that basically rates theoretically could be held constant for the next decade and will still provide the right amount of revenue on the wastewater side. So it is really water that we're trying to address some funding gaps within. So perhaps more informative, the next two charts translate those rates into what this might mean to a typical residential or non-residential customer. So this first chart here is showing what the total water wastewater bill would be for a typical residential customer consuming about 127 cubic meters of water annually. So about 37 cubic meters of that being chargeable. For that customer, the total water wastewater bill based on the rates that are currently in effect would be $2,344. And then you see with the bars to the right of that, how that bill would change each year of the forecast period with the rate forecast that's been put together. And so as an example, in 2026, that customer would expect to see about a $78 increase to their combined water wastewater bill, which represents an increase of about 3.3%. So even though we were looking at a relatively significant increase to water rates at about 10%, as I mentioned earlier, for the next 5 years, because we're not suggesting that wastewater rates need to increase, the combined effect on the water wastewater bill would be an increase of about 3.3% in 2026. So that's for a typical residential customer. And again, we'll see that that total bill impact ranges from 3.3% to about 4% by 2030. And then it kind of levels off around 1.1% annual increases thereafter out to 2035. A very similar illustration here on the next slide, this time looking at a hypothetical non-residential customer. So same size connection, however, a greater amount of consumption. So consuming about 330 cubic meters of water annually, which would mean that about 150 cubic meters of that consumption is chargeable. For this type of non-residential customer, the total water wastewater bill in 2025 would be about $4,429. And with the increase that's forecasted for 2026, they would see about $147 more on their combined water wastewater bill, which again would correspond to an increase of about 3.3%. And so similar impacts on that total water wastewater bill over the next 5 years, again ranging from 3.3 to 4% over that period, and then leveling off around 1.3 to 1.5% year-over-year increases thereafter. All right, so then the final part here, just for some contextual information, wanted to provide a comparison of the typical water wastewater bills in a selection of municipalities within the general area here. As I just mentioned a short while ago, for a typical residential customer, again, consuming about 127 cubic meters of water annually, that current water wastewater bill is about $2,344, which does put the municipality at the high end relative to the comparator municipalities. And you'll see that illustrated on the left-hand side of the chart there. And there are, I think, two main contributors to why the costs are so much higher. And one I already mentioned, and that's the fact that this is a relatively small system. So you're not benefiting from the economies of scale of a larger system and spreading those costs over a greater customer base. And particularly with services like water wastewater, we see that that does have a very big impact on what the customer costs are. So that's one significant factor. The other one is that many municipalities, and that's obviously not possible to show in a chart like this, but many municipalities are facing significant funding gaps within both tax supported as well as water wastewater supported rates and assets. And through the asset management planning work that's been completed over the past few years, municipalities are identifying those gaps and starting to address them. And so in many cases, as I mentioned earlier, you're currently funding about 80% of those long run life cycle costs of the infrastructure. Many municipalities are much lower than that. So the gap is a lot bigger and have a lot more work to do to catch up. And so what we're expecting to see is that there will be continued pressure on those water wastewater rates and resultant bills, which might see some of those municipalities moving closer to where your water wastewater bills are currently. So again, something that's very hard to show on a chart like this, but just through the work that we have been doing, I know that that's a challenge that many municipalities are facing. And so then the final slide is a similar chart, again, this time for that hypothetical commercial customer with about 330 cubic meters of water consumption annually, again, showing that within Merrickville-Wolford, those water wastewater bills would be significantly higher than in the surveyed municipalities that are included in the chart. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, looking to answer any questions you might have, receive any feedback. Following this engagement, we are going to be preparing the formal water wastewater asset management plan and rate study report, which will provide all the details that you just walked through. I just again wanted to share this with council at this stage in a more informal setting before we issue the report. And then once that report is issued, we'll be looking for council approval of that document. And I think it was mentioned earlier, I will be back here in June, so we can continue the conversation then as needed as well.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So, council, how did you want to approach this? Did you want to go back to the slide and go through each little slide with any questions that you may have, or do you have just a general question that you'd like to ask? Go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
This is a lot of detail to try to absorb in a half-hour presentation. I would really like some time to stop and think and develop some questions based on a better understanding. I've written down a couple of things, but I need more time to absorb the information, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think we're probably all in the same boat, Deputy Mayor. It was just an opportunity to ask a couple of quick questions, and I think it would probably be in our best interest as we develop these questions that we can funnel them through the CAO, and hopefully Peter has time to answer some of those questions prior to our next meeting, so that we can come back a little bit more educated and have a little bit deeper understanding of what you just presented to us. Go ahead, Councillor.
I just have a general question. I don't know if you know off the top of your hand. How does our infrastructure replacement, well, you said that about 60% of the water mains are like looking to something that should be replaced. I mean, we've heard stories of cities like Calgary, stuff like that, and how do we compare it to other centers around? Is that the average around the country, or are we higher or lower, that type of thing?
It really varies, and I think it varies in areas of municipalities as well, right? Some municipalities that have seen more recent development and a lot of development might have a very relatively young infrastructure profile. There are others like yourselves, which are getting to that point where significant replacement and renewal is needed. So I would say it really varies, and not just across the province, but within individual municipalities as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
Councillor Ireland, did you have anything you'd like to ask or add?
Yes, I may have missed something you said, but the escalation for the wastewater infrastructure, your graph didn't show any change in the next 10 years. Why is that? And that's all seems to be built into the water.
Right, so when we look at the amount of revenue that the current wastewater rates are generating, it is covering the annual operating costs as well as the average annual life cycle cost of the capital infrastructure. So it indicates that the current rates fully fund both the capital and operating needs of wastewater. There will continue to be inflationary pressures on the costs. However, what we're seeing is that with the anticipated amount of development and the new customers that will be added to the system, that will offset those inflationary adjustments. So there will be increases in revenue without increasing rates due to the customer and consumption growth. And so what we're seeing, the analysis suggests, is that even without any adjustments to the wastewater rates, they will continue to generate an appropriate amount of revenue over the 10-year forecast period.
And quick follow-up. So the pipes in the ground that we know are in quite bad shape as far as the drainage system, sewer system. Do they not factor into this? Or are you saying there is adequate income on that side to cover that replacement?
It is factored in, and yes, there will still be the need to go to some external borrowing to help pay for the 10-year capital replacement plan for wastewater mains as well. But again, the revenues are, or the rates are appropriate in light of the long run average annual life cycle cost of the capital. So the rates will be sufficient to pay for any debt servicing cost that might be incurred over the period as well.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Andrew.
I guess I do have one kind of big umbrella question. Will this kind of planning prevent or mitigate in 50, 60 years' time going through this massive amount of repair that needs to be done now? In other words, does this plan build in some proactive maintenance or replacement rather than waiting like we have now since 1947 or 1950 to address the pipes that are in the ground? So in other words, can we avoid this kind of challenge in the future?
Yes and no. I think financially, that's what the hope is. They were designing a rate forecast that will provide a sufficient amount of funding to address things proactively as they come up, so they don't have to be deferred. I think the other part of it, the no part, is that just by virtue of when that infrastructure was first put in service, those needs are very lumpy, right? So there's well, again, 2/3 of the infrastructure was put in the ground around the same time. And so it's getting to that point in its life cycle where replacement is required around the same time as well. And I think there typically are some opportunities to maybe spread out that replacement over time. But at the same time, I think you want to make sure you're maximizing the useful life that you're getting out of that infrastructure as well. So you'll continue to see, as you go through this next round of replacement, again, 80 years down the road from there will again be a bit of a peak in replacement needs at that point in time as well. So it can be to some extent mitigated, and hopefully the financial strategy is such that it allows for capital needs to be addressed proactively as they come up without having to defer things to later because there's no money to pay for that. But there will still need to be some peaks and valleys around capital replacement. And that's where the reserve fund really plays a critical role. And so we're trying to design rates that provide a sustainable level of annual contributions to that reserve fund so that that reserve fund can grow over time. And when that next peak of replacements comes up, you're not facing rate pressures or borrowing pressures. That reserve fund is there that can be drawn down to help offset those needs.
Thank you.
Okay, just a quick clarification. You had mentioned earlier about you had recommended, you were looking at a 10-year replacement model, but decided to go to a 10 to 20-year replacement model because of the lack of connections that we have, so lack of financial support. As we grow and continue that growth, can we accelerate that timeline? Because over a 20-year period with infrastructure that we have in the ground right now that's leaking pretty bad, allowing some of that to live for another 20 years may not be in our best interest. May put us into a situation, into an environmental situation, which would be something that would be even more costly. So as we continue to grow, is it in our best interest to continue to grow? Because what you just said to the deputy mayor, that we're going to take a look at the funding models and how we manage those funding models into the future to help us pay and offset some of those costs. We can mitigate some of the challenges, but not all, because infrastructure, when it breaks down and you're replacing a large amount of it in a short period of time, will come back up again at this for renewal at the same time. So if I'm understanding what you're trying to tell us is that growth is something that we should be proactive with. Do we have a system in place that will meet the current needs as it exists today? Or do we need to start planning long-term over the next 15 to 20 years, how we continue to grow, to continue to feed in financial to that system? Is that something that we should be seriously considering?
So certainly growth and having a larger customer base helps spread those costs over a larger customer base or reduces the cost per unit.
Mhm.
Right, so certainly from a cost efficiency standpoint, growth can be beneficial within any existing constraints that might exist, right? I think my understanding is that there is a sufficient capacity within the water system to allow growth to continue for some time. I think the constraints have been around the wastewater system. And so, yes, growth would be beneficial, but it also, if there is, for example, a significant expansion of the wastewater treatment plant that's required, then that needs to be assessed relative to the initial investment required to enable that to happen as well. I think currently the thinking is that with the replacement program that's been put into the forecast for wastewater mains, some of the inflow and infiltration issues may be addressed, and that will free up some capacity effectively at the treatment plant. So it's not necessarily creating, or it's creating additional capacity without a treatment plant expansion, but that will come to a point where that's no longer going to generate enough additional capacity. So I think when you get to that point, that would require a more detailed assessment of the costs versus the benefits of expanding that treatment capacity.
Yeah, and I asked the question because what we're trying to do is we're trying to hold what we have here, like the village field. And, it's a double-edged sword growing, the more you grow, the more you grow, the more you need to grow, the more you need to grow, the more finances you need. It never seems to end. But, I think if we're taking a look at what we're looking at today and the challenge that we have, if we go out to our present ability within our current urban area, I sort of feel that 20 years or 25 years from now, we'll be back into the same position because we won't have that consistent continued growth to continue feeding financially to the system. So our price rates will have to continually rise because we can only grow so much. And to grow out and to put in all brand new infrastructure to continue, that is that procedure to continue to grow would be at a large expense. So I'm just sort of trying to get my head around what you presented to us and the situation that we're currently in. I just see if we don't move proactively forward, we're going to be in the same situation probably 25 or 30 years from now. When that chart ends at 2035, if we haven't looked at what we need to do to continue that sustainability, we'll be right back into the same position. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. And I think that's something that typically would be addressed through a master servicing plan or similar type of master planning document. I think the other side of it too is that, and once that any infrastructure expansion is identified, that would need to be again looked at through the rate study as well, right? To see what the ongoing implications of that are once it's in place, with the initial funding arrangements for that new infrastructure would be. And then the other part of it too is that as development occurs, particularly through subdivisions, there is additional infrastructure that the municipality assumes through that process as well. And even though it's no cost to take it on, however, the life cycle costs of that infrastructure become the municipality's responsibility and the customer's responsibility from that point forward.
Yeah.
So all of that needs to be taken into account holistically.
Yes. So and I think at one time there was a conversation that you had presented to previous council about the number 10,000 connections being a point where it sort of makes the model a more sustainable financial animal, I guess. 10,000 connections. Right now we're probably around 413 connections. So we do have a bit of a challenge there, as you pointed out, that we do have that challenge that we face. And growth essentially is going to help keep the wastewater at its current charge right through to 2035. That's because if we continue to grow, if we don't grow, then I imagine that funding model would need to change if we don't bring on those 192 plus. Yeah, okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Anybody else have any other questions? No? Okay, so, clerk, can you remind, we moved and we seconded that?
We have, but we
Okay,
do still have the development charges presentation.
oh, sorry.
One more to go.
One more to go. I was trying to get you home before dark, Peter.
Thank you. No, but really good discussion. Again, I appreciate that it's a lot of information that we're sharing without council having had the opportunity to review it in advance. We just wanted to make sure that we could provide some narrative to go with it, and then hopefully you have a chance to review the presentation materials after the fact. And like was mentioned, I'm certainly available to answer any questions that might come in writing, and I'll be back in June around the tax supported part of the asset management plan as well, so we can revisit some of these conversations then as well. So no immediate decisions need to be made at this point. I guess that's the takeaway. We just wanted to share some of the preliminary findings from the work that's been completed.
Can I ask one question? In the one chart, you compared us with other municipalities whose rates are lower. And your suggestion that they're probably gonna have to increase and ours will be more like the normal, is that what will happen?
I don't necessarily think we'll quite see them at the same level, right? We will see those rates increasing. I think when we looked at even recently did some survey work across the province, and what we see that the average rate of increase over the past decade to water wastewater bills was around, I think it was 4.5 or 5.5%. So exceeding the rate of inflation generally over that period, as municipalities continue to work towards addressing their funding gap. So I think we'll likely see municipalities move kind of closer to where you are, but just by virtue of being a very small system, I think those costs are likely to still be at the high end.
Okay. And do any of those other municipalities fund through taxation, or is it all by water rates?
So I can't speak off the top of my head to specifically the ones that were in the survey. I want to say that probably most, if not all of those, would have their water wastewater needs fully funded through user rates. There are still some municipalities in the province that partially fund water wastewater through taxation, but we have definitely seen municipalities moving away from that.
Thank you.
So we're going on to development charges then?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so in this next presentation, we're going to talk about development charges. So as a mechanism to help fund infrastructure expansion and upgrades that might be required as the community grows. We can probably just go right to the next slide here. So just to explain for some context what the intent today is, it does not represent a formal development charges background study, not yet. What we committed to doing is a initial kind of high-level preliminary feasibility assessment, if you will, to give council an idea of what type of infrastructure upgrades and expansion could potentially be funded through a development charge, and to provide a very high-level estimate of what those development charges could look like on a per house basis, and then eventually to get direction from council as to whether this is something council would like us to pursue more formally through a formal development charges background study and everything that comes with that, and eventually potentially putting council in a position to consider approval of a development charges bylaw. So again, some preliminary assessment around that. So let's go 2 slides forward. I want to provide a little bit of context for what development charges are. Development charges are a discretionary mechanism, first of all, that's available to municipalities. And the intent of development charges is to help recover the capital costs that are associated with both residential and non-residential development within a municipality. Development charges are based on the growth pays for growth principle, helping ensure that existing taxpayers and ratepayers are not burdened with the cost of, again, infrastructure expansion and upgrade that's required to accommodate growth within the municipality. The costs that are typically covered by a development charge are in addition to the infrastructure that you would require a developer to in place as part of a subdivision process. So when approving a subdivision, typically the developer will be responsible for putting in place the pipes, putting in place the roadways, sidewalks, streetlights, and so on. So that's not covered through development charges because that's direct developer responsibility. So the development charge really is a mechanism to help fund those broader infrastructure expansions that aren't tied to any one particular development. So for example, if there was a need to, and we'll look at some specific examples shortly, but if there was a need to pave a road that was previously gravel because of increased traffic volumes that are going to be traveling on that road as a result of development, that's an example of an upgrade that we may seek to fund through the development charge. If there was a need to expand or build a new fire station, for example, or a new fire station to provide services out of it and another area of the municipality because there's more development and more demand there, that's an example of a infrastructure expansion that we would potentially look for development charges to fund. So just to help explain how these fit in. Municipalities are empowered to impose development charges via the Development Charges Act. It's a piece of legislation that's gone through several amendments in recent years, but that is the mechanism that enables municipalities to impose these charges. So then on the next slide, and again, I know that's too small probably to even make out on the slide there. I'll just walk through the few kind of major steps that are involved in undertaking a development charges background study. And again, to this point, we haven't done this as formally as required by the Development Charges Act. We've done some preliminary assessments, but ultimately what would need to be done and what goes into the assessment is, firstly, the process starts by looking at what is the anticipated amount of growth within the municipality, both in terms of the type, so is it residential, non-residential, what types of units are likely to develop, as well as the location and of course amount of that growth. So it's trying to understand how much growth is expected. Once we have an idea of how much growth is expected to occur, we then have to establish the anticipated increase in need for services that's expected to be generated by that growth. And typically that starts off with a fairly broad assessment of, will we need more wastewater treatment capacity? Will we need more traffic capacity? Will we need more capacity within recreational facilities or new additional firefighting staff to help offset the increase in need for services that's generated by that growth? And then one of the tests under the Development Charges Act is we have to measure that increase in need for services that's identified relative to the historical level of service that's been provided in the municipality over the past 15 years. And the reason for that test is that to ensure that the development charge doesn't become a mechanism that allows a municipality to fund increases in the level of service. It's really intended to be a funding mechanism that allows a municipality to maintain a level of service even as the community grows. So that's just one of the tests that we have to observe under the Act. So once we've identified in general terms that increase in need for services attributable to growth, we start to look at specific capital projects or specific investments that would need to be made to help create that additional capacity. So again, is it additional facility space? Do we need additional equipment because we're assuming sidewalks through the subdivision process and we need a new sidewalk machine to help plow those sidewalks? That type of assessment. So specific capital projects or expenditures that would be expected to help offset or address that increase in need for services. Once we identify those capital projects and their respective costs, there are some deductions we have to observe as required by the Development Charges Act. The most notable ones being to the extent that the municipality expects to receive grant funding for some of those projects, that has to be deducted so that we're not asking both developments to fund something that a grant is paying for. And then the second one that's quite big is what's called the benefit to existing within the context of the Development Charges Act. And this is looking at whether as a result of any of the capital works, there will be a benefit to the existing population that will be generated. So a good example of that would be, let's say we identify the need to build a new recreation center, but that new recreation center is going to both replace an existing one, which will be demolished, but it's also going to be a larger facility. So to the extent that it's replacing an existing footprint, an existing amount of gross floor area, that portion of the facility, let's say it's half of the new facility, would be or the new facility is twice as large as the old one. So half of it would be deducted as a benefit to existing, and only half of the cost will be included for potential recovery through the development charge mechanism. So that benefit to existing deduction is something we have to assess on a project by project basis. In addition to the capital costs, we also have the ability to include any financing costs related to the capital projects, to the extent that the municipality expects to need to borrow money to fund those expenditures. And then once we have those costs, we're dividing those costs by the anticipated amount of developments to come up with a development charge. And initially, typically, the development charge is calculated on a per capita basis, and then that charge per capita is translated into a charge per unit for different types of residential units based on average occupancy levels. So recognizing that a single detached home has a larger, higher number of occupants on average than an apartment unit, the development charge will be correspondingly higher for the single detached home. So that's kind of the math part of it. Then there's the policy side of it as well, where we have to look at various matters related to the bylaw itself that enables the imposition of the charge. So we have to look at whether the charges will apply municipal wide or whether they will only apply in certain areas of the municipality. Good example of that would be water wastewater services, where typically water wastewater development charges are only imposed in areas that actually connect to water wastewater services. But there are other examples where there are very localized needs where the development charge could be imposed on a more area specific basis. And then there are some other considerations in terms of when will the municipality require payment from someone coming in for a building permit to pay the development charge, whether there should be any exemptions from the development charge observed for certain types of development, and other matters like that. So we won't be getting into any of the policy matters today. That's for a later date. If that's something that council would like to pursue, we're going to focus more on kind of what are the types of capital needs that we have identified based on a preliminary assessment and what that could translate into in terms of a development charge. On the next slide, we have a summary of the services that are eligible for inclusion in a development charge, as specified within the Development Charges Act. Again, providing the full list of services here. And what we have highlighted with the teal color are services where we have had some specific discussions with the municipality staff and have identified some capital needs needed as the community is expected to grow. Water was the first one on the list was considered, but there are no immediate expansionary needs within the water system. So that's been looked at, but we haven't identified any capital needs at this point. But we have identified some capital expansion needs with respect to wastewater services related to a highway, which are your roads and related, so general public works items, fire services, as well as parks and recreation. So those are the 4 areas that we'll look at in a little bit more detail shortly. So that's the list of eligible services. On the next slide, just a quick summary of what costs within those services can actually be included in the calculation of a charge. So the eligible capital costs include costs to purchase land or interest in land. They include costs related to making improvements to land, acquiring or constructing facilities, equipment and rolling stock, as well as capital leases related to these items. So it doesn't necessarily need to be purchased or constructed, but if there's a capital lease, that can be included as well. Circulation materials for libraries can be included to the extent there may be a need to expand circulation materials, even though they may not be considered capital in the traditional sense of the word. As mentioned earlier, any interest costs on money borrowed to pay for these capital needs can be included in the calculation of the charge as well. And then finally, the costs don't necessarily need to be incurred directly by the municipality, but if they are incurred to be or if they are to be incurred by another entity providing the service on behalf of the municipality, those could potentially be included as well. On the right-hand side, then a few notable exclusions from the list of eligible capital costs. So we cannot include the cost of acquiring land for the purposes of parks. That's simply because there are provisions under the Planning Act that allow municipalities to require conveyance of park land or payments, cash in lieu payments in that regard. Also, the act prohibits us from including any vehicles or equipments that have a useful life of less than 7 years from the development charge. And finally, computer equipment generally is not eligible for funding through the development charge mechanism. So to get right into the kind of preliminary assessment completed, so the table on slide 8 here provides a summary of the amount of development that we're looking at over the next 10 years, so 2026 to 2035. Within the rural areas, so including any rural consents and a number of rural subdivisions, we're expecting a growth of about 296 residential units over that 10-year timeframe. And within the urban areas, so serviced by water and wastewater, a growth of about 189 additional residential units. And that's that same number we looked at within the water wastewater presentation a short while ago. So then relative to that growth, we've had some discussions around what are some, is a relatively significant amount of growth that's expected over the next 10 years. So we had an initial look at what types of infrastructure upgrades or expansions may be required over the next 10 years to help ensure that service levels are maintained as the community grows. And so what we see in the table here is that those inclusions in the initial assessment broken down by service area. So in terms of roads, what we've looked at are some gravel road conversions that would include some widening of the respective roadways as well, that might be triggered by that growth and the increased traffic volumes resulting from it. We also identified the need for some additional facility space, as well as some additional vehicles and equipment, like a sidewalk plow, a new plow truck, an excavator, and some other items as well. And then finally, a road need study update or a portion of the cost of a road need study update have been included as well, recognizing that that will help continue informing where road upgrades may need to be performed as in traffic volumes increase as development occurs. And so in total, then in the third column of the table, you will see the initial, again, preliminary assessment of what the development charge eligible capital cost would be. That could be potentially included in the calculation of the charge. So for roads, we've identified about $7.85 million of growth related capital needs that could potentially be included. And then for illustrative purposes in the final column of the table, we are showing what that would work out to in light of the growth forecast that we looked at on the previous slide. When we divide that amount of eligible capital cost by the amount of residential units that are expected to develop over that period, that would translate into about $16,200 per single detached residential unit for the roads component. Moving down the table then, in terms of fire services, what was identified as the need for a new satellite station, some additional fire apparatus, as well as equipment in terms of the SCBA and bunker gear for additional firefighters as the community grows, as well as a fire master plan and station location study, which would be beneficial to have to understand where to best locate that satellite station as there are new developments across the municipality. So in total, we've identified that about $3.5 million of capital needs could potentially be recovered over the next 10 years through the development charge. And that would translate into a development charge of about $7,250 per single detached residential unit. In terms of parks and recreation, there's been the need for some additional facilities and upgrades to provide additional capacity within that service area, as well as the completion of a parks and recreation master plan, which would again help inform and guide the types of investments needed to support community growth over the coming years. About $330,000 of capital have been included within parks and recreation for potential recovery through the development charge, translating into a charge of $670 per single detached residential unit. And then finally, in terms of wastewater, recognizing that the infrastructure, as we talked about with the water wastewater rate study discussion, the wastewater infrastructure is not yet in the point in its life cycle when it would require replacement, theoretically. However, there are some inflow and infiltration issues that persist and that need to be addressed in order to allow future development to occur. So it was felt appropriate to include a small share of those those wastewater pipe replacements in the calculation of the development charge, to recognize that some of that really is being done or accelerated up to this point in time to free up capacity at the treatment plant. So it is a different way of creating capacity to allow growth to occur. So there is a small share of the wastewater main replacement program that could potentially be funded through the development charge, as well as the ongoing CCTV inspections and grouting program related to the wastewater pipes that's been included as well as a master servicing study to help inform those longer run needs as well. And so in total, about $640,000 of development charge eligible capital costs have been included for wastewater services. And that translates into about $3,400 per unit. The number is larger than for Parks and Recreation, even though the total capital needs are only about double, because the number of units that we would be spreading those wastewater costs over is a lot smaller than for Parks and Recreation, which is a municipal-wide service. So just wanted to point that out. And so based on this preliminary assessment, there would be potentially about $12.3 million of development charge revenues that we would be looking at over the next 10 years. So from 2026 to 2035. And to generate that, that would translate into a development charge of about $27,520 per single detached residential unit. As I mentioned earlier, eventually that charge would be shown, or we would have different charges for different types of units, as well as a charge for non-residential development. At this point, again, we haven't done the detailed work to try to estimate how many different types of units or of different types would develop. It's just for illustrative purposes. We're just looking at the potential charge per single detached unit.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
So in the roads, is there a breakdown for rural and urban? Is there a different percentage for rural and a different percentage for urban?
We've done, so typically the roads program, and what we've done here as well, is treated on a municipal wide basis. So there's no differentiation between urban versus rural, because typically the road network is just that, it's a network, right? And it's hard to say that, you know, the traffic volumes on this road are generated just from a development here. It's going to be developments from all areas of the municipality that contribute to that.
But in your urban area, you've got your sidewalks, you've got all your bells and whistles, streetlights and the whole work, so it will cost more to do urban, more than likely.
Yeah, so that's reflected in the individual project cost estimates. I was just suggesting that in terms of calculating a development charge, we wouldn't typically differentiate between urban and rural areas.
Thank you.
So with that, then, to just provide some in context for where that current charge is landing, and again, this is a very high level preliminary assessment. What we wanted to provide here is a survey of the development charges that would be applicable to a single detached home in a range of area municipalities. You will see that the range is quite big. The lowest development charges here are in the Nation municipality, about $5,400 per single detached home. Whereas that charge can go up to about $63,700 per single detached home in certain parts of Ottawa. When we look at kind of the median or middle of the pack, I think we're looking at the village of Castleman, which is about middle of the chart, with development charges of about $23,500 per unit currently. And with the number that, you know, we've calculated based on this preliminary assessment of about $27,500 per unit, that would be very much in line with what you see for Brockville and Mississippi Mills, which are just to the left of Castleman on the chart there. I would note, though, that these are always a moving target, and municipalities are going through the assessment now. I know, working with Mississippi Mills in particular, for example, their charge might be going up to about $45,000 per unit relatively soon. So pretty big jump from where they are currently. I also want to note that these are hard comparisons to make, because the development charge in each community reflects their specific development needs and pressures. Just like what we talked about with, in your case, for water services, right? If there is existing capacity and no need to expand, the development charge for that service might be zero or very small. Whereas another municipality might need a major expansion of a water treatment plants to allow any additional development to occur, so they might have a very large charge. So again, depending on what specific services are included in the charge and what specific expansionary needs exist in each individual service, it's going to have an impact on the charge, but just wanted to provide you with some context for what we typically see in other area municipalities. So then in terms of next steps, we wanted to provide again this very preliminary initial assessment to council. Eventually, we will be seeking direction from council whether this is something you'd like to pursue more formally. In terms of what that more formal process would look like, we would need to undertake a development charges background study, which would just lay out the information in a lot more detail as required by the Development Charges Act. Development charges bylaws are appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal, so it is important to make sure that the due process is followed. So we would need a little bit more of a formal assessment of the growth forecast, all the capital needs, that historical service standards, and just a little bit more detail around some of the preliminary assessment that's been completed to date. If we completed that development charges background study, if that's something council wanted to pursue, there would be a requirement to hold a statutory public meeting as required by the Act, and then that would put council in a position to potentially consider adopting a development charge bylaw. To give you an idea of timeframes, that development charge background study process, the preparation of the study itself would probably take about 1.5 months, let's say, just because we've already done some of the legwork to this point. So just more formal assessment of it. So again, about 1.5 months. And then that development charge study would need to be published on the municipality's website, and it would need to be there for at least 60 days prior to council considering approval of a development charge bylaw. So let's say we started proceeding with that formal process right away. We would probably be looking at council being in a position to consider a development charge bylaw in around September, just to give you an idea of the overall timeframe. So again, very kind of high level preliminary assessment, but more so here to answer any questions you might have either about the process itself or other capital needs that you feel you may want to consider as part of this process.
Okay, thank you. Well done. Any questions from members? Go ahead, Councillor.
More overarching question. But legislatively, like they're talking about, building homes quickly, like so the federal government's talking about making things easier to build, provincial government's taking it easier to build. How much have development charge fee, that development fees changed over the last couple of years, just with the legislation changing and in terms of what municipalities are allowed to charge, cutbacks, just with the idea to encourage development and try down the costs, cheapen housing costs, whether they work or not. But yeah, like how much have you seen in the last couple of years of changes even in the type of development fees allowed?
Yeah, I think we've seen quite a bit, and that's probably partially why development charges have been in the headlines quite a bit, in light of the housing affordability crisis that we're facing. And development charges have been increasing in quite a bit in many municipalities. And that's been a result of just the inflationary pressures that municipalities face, right? So, and the identification of again, expansionary needs within those municipalities. In terms of the legislative changes, I would hesitate to say that we've seen development charges be reduced as a result of them. What we have seen, however, is the introduction of various exemptions. So for example, affordable housing is statutorily exempt from the payment of development charges as defined under the Act. Not-for-profit housing is another example. There are discounts for rental housing units that based on the number of bedrooms within a unit. So the legislation has introduced a number of exemptions and discounts or reductions from the payment of development charges, which ultimately do reduce how much a municipality can recover through the charge. So that whole growth pays for growth principle, I don't think development charges fully pay for growth, but they help get you partway there.
Okay, great, thanks.
Any other questions? None? Yeah, go ahead, Councilor.
Do we need to give staff direction to take the next step of requesting, do we have a quote on the study at this point, or? Is that the next step?
We haven't reached out for a quote. This is our special council meeting. If council wants to give direction to proceed, it's certainly acceptable.
Go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
I would like to move then that we ask or direct staff to begin the process of establishing the cost of conducting the study.
So we have a mover, do we have a seconder? I'll second that. Okay, so we'll open up discussions on that, so. Do we need any further discussion on that, or are we just putting that motion to direct staff to bring back?
I have
The cost.
nothing, I have nothing to add to
You
the
have nothing to
motion, but happy to have a discussion.
Yeah, any comments or any questions? No?
Pretty straightforward.
Okay, so we have a direction on the floor, so we'll call for support for that. Do we need to call
Probably need a seconder.
for, well, we do have a seconder,
Oh, sorry.
so do we just give it as a verbal direction, or are we gonna put that into the motion?
Minutes, I
So,
can read it out.
yeah, would you please read that out?
So move by Deputy Mayor Barr, seconded by Councillor Ireland, that council direct staff to proceed with obtaining a quote for development charges study to bring back to council for consideration.
We could bring it to the committee of the whole. How quick can you get it?
Quickly,
Okay.
when is committee of the whole?
It's the 9th of June.
9th of June, yeah, couple of
We
weeks.
can,
Take the committee of the whole.
Okay, so no further discussions or questions, so we'll call the vote, all in favor, and that's carried, thank you. There we go. So we'll call the vote on accepting the presentation. We're done, Peter? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So all those in favor of the presentation, accepting the presentation? And that's carried. Thank you. All in favor? We'll move on to the confirmatory bylaw 28/2025. The Council Corporation of Village of Merrickville-Wolford give first, second, third, and final reading to bylaw 28/2025. Being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council for the special meeting of May 10 or May 20, 2025, and further that authorization be given to the mayor clerk to sign, seal, and place in the bylaw book for the municipality bylaw number 28/2025. May I have a mover, please?
I'll move.
Thank you. Seconder, please.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Call the vote. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. We'll move on to adjournment. The Council Corporation of the Village of Merrickville-Wolford adjourn at, I believe that's 4:26. And PM. May I have a mover, please? Move it. Thank you. And seconder, please.
I'll second.
Moved and second. Call the vote. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Thank you very much.